So in the last lecture, we did a simple AJAX call to fetch data from a country's API. So we created a function for that, and as we called the function multiple times, multiple AJAX calls were made at the same time. So they were basically running in parallel, and we could not control which one finished first. Remember that? However, in this lecture, let's create a sequence of AJAX calls so that the second one runs only after the first one has finished. And here's what we're going to do. So in the country's data here, there is some property of the bordering countries. So you see, this one here has the code ESP, which stands for Spain. And so that's because Spain is a bordering country of Portugal. And so what we will do now is after the first AJAX call is completed, we will get this border, and then based on this code, we will also render the neighboring country right here besides the original country. And so in this case, the second AJAX call really depends on the first one, because the data about neighboring countries is of course a result of the first call. So without the first call, we wouldn't even know which data to fetch in the second call. And so what we need to implement is a sequence of AJAX call. So here I already copied the function from the last lecture, which is still up here. And so let's call this one here now get country and neighbor. Okay, so again we get the country as an input, and then here we do the first AJAX call, and then once the load event is fired, when the data arrives, we then handle that data. And so everything that we have here is still the same. Now, we will do this part here another time. So basically, once the neighboring country arrives, we also will want to render this one. And so let's export this functionality into its own function so that we don't have to copy it later. And this also makes this function a little bit cleaner. So render country is going to be a function which simply takes in some data. And so like this, we don't have to change the variable names in here. Okay. And so now here, let's then actually call that function. So render country with data. And now we get this error here because of course this function no longer exists. So get country and neighbor. So as I save this now, this should look the same as before. And so indeed it does. Okay, but now here let's actually get the neighbor country. So let's write that. Get neighbor country. And here actually let's also do some comments now. So render country 1, let's say. And here I will say AJAX call country 1. So the neighbor country will then be country 2. So the neighbor is going to be data.borders, I believe. So let's just check that here again. And so this is actually an array. And so we will simply render the first element. So in the case of Portugal, there's just one border, but in other countries like Germany, there's like 10 borders or something. So let's just destructure here, basically just take the first element. But of course, there are also countries which have no neighbors at all. So islands, basically. And so for these cases, let's simply make sure that we don't run into any mistakes. And so in that case, we simply return immediately. But of course, if the neighbor does exist, then now we can do the second AJAX call. And so let's copy all of this. And so here, AJAX call 2. And now here, of course, we don't want to use the country, but we want to use the neighbor. But there is one particularity about that, because here the border So this one here, this country, actually doesn't come with the name of the country, but with this code. Okay? But using our API, we can actually also search by the code. So right here we have that. So right now we are using the name, but as I said, we can also search for the code. And so all we have to change is basically here from name to alpha. So that's alpha here, and then here, the neighbor. All right. Okay. And so now, just like before, we have to then listen for the load event on this new request. And let's call this request 2, because of course we can't do that on the same request that we did here in the beginning. So request 2, add event listener, load, and then our callback function. And so you're starting to see now that the second AJAX call, in the way we are setting it up here, is really dependent on the first one. So that's because basically we are firing off the second AJAX call here in the callback function of the first one, right? So basically inside of this callback function, we are now adding a new event listener for the new request. And so here we now have one callback inside of the other one. All right. And so we will talk about that once we have this code working. But for now, let's actually take a look at the result here. And so that's going to be request, or actually just the this keyword. So this dot response text. So let's see. And indeed, now we got data about Spain. And no matter how many times we reload the page, it will now always appear after Portugal. All right, because there's no way that this AJAX call here can be made before the one on Portugal. Okay, and so now, well, let's just do the same as we did here. So we don't need this. Let's say data2 should be JSON.parse, and then this. And of course, we need to also destructure it then, logging it to the console. But now we get some error here. So let's just take a look at the result itself without any destructuring. Oh, and so now it works. And the reason for that is that the response of this API is actually no longer an array when we search for the code. So here we have this alpha, remember, and so this time we are searching for country codes and not for country names. And so the country codes are unique, and so therefore they can always just be one result. And so that's the reason why no array is returned. And probably it says here so in the documentation. Well, it doesn't say so, but if we would have just simply inspected the response here, then we would have understood that as well. But anyway, now it worked, and so let's now render this country here as well. So data2, and now let's wait, and there it is. Great. Now actually I created a special class here for the neighboring country so that it appears a little bit smaller. And so when it is the neighbor, we want to attach some class here to the country. And so let's pass that class in. So let's say class name, and by default we set it to nothing. So here we will just add it to the string like this. And now when it is a neighbor, we can just pass in neighbor like this. Give it a save. And yeah, so that looks a bit nicer. We get the information that this is a neighbor country. And so now let's try this, for example, for the USA as well. But now I just want to do one at a time. So here we should probably get Mexico or Canada. And indeed, here it is. Here is Canada, the neighboring country of the US. And so one more time, this second AJAX call would not have been possible without the first one. Because otherwise, how would we know that the second country here needed to be Canada? Okay, so again, we have one AJAX call here that depends on another one. And so what we have here is one callback function inside of another one. So you see, here we attach the first callback function, and then inside of that, we have yet another one. So in other words, here we have nested callbacks. But now imagine that we wanted to do more requests in sequence, like the neighbor of the neighbor of the neighbor, and like 10 times over. So in that case, we would end up with callbacks inside of callbacks, like 10 times. And actually, for that kind of structure and for that kind of behavior, we have a special name. And that special name is callback hell. So basically, callback hell is when we have a lot of nested callbacks in order to execute asynchronous tasks in sequence. And in fact, this happens for all asynchronous tasks which are handled by callbacks, and not just AJAX calls. So, for example, let's say we have a setTimeout function, and then here we want to log something to the console like 1 second passed, but then also we want to start another timeout. Let's just set 1000 here. So let's copy this one here. And so, as I just said, let's say that here we wanted to start a new timer after the first timer has finished. So here we can say 2 seconds passed, and we can even add another one. So never mind about what just happened in the console. And here, why not add yet another one? All right. And so now they should appear like 1, 2, 3, 4. And so here too, of course, we have callback hell. And in fact, callback hell is pretty easy to identify by this triangular shape that is formed here. You see that? And also the same is starting to appear here. Right? So if we had more callbacks in here, then we would start to see a lot more indentation here. And then this triangular shape would also appear there. Now, the problem with callback hell is that it makes our code look very messy. But even more important, it makes our code hard to maintain and very difficult to understand and to reason about. And code that is hard to understand and difficult to reason about will have more bugs and is just worse code. So this is a great rule that you should always remember and keep in mind. So again, the rule is that code that's hard to understand is basically bad code because it will have more bugs. Because the harder it is to understand code and to reason about the code, the more difficult it will be to add new features and to add more functionality to the application. But anyway, given all these problems with callback hell, we of course need a way to solve callback hell. And fortunately for us, since ES6, there is actually a way of escaping callback hell by using something called promises. And so let's now take the next step in our journey of asynchronous JavaScript, which is to learn all about promises.